Okay, thank you to both of our keynote speakers this morning. Lord Bradley's just about to take his leave, and thanks very much for coming. I think that's given us a great foundation to build upon. However, our building will be a little bit slower than planned. I've already told you that Gary Doherty isn't able to be here this morning, so that is our workshop Choice C out. And I've just heard, unfortunately, that Richard Curran has also sent his apologies, and that is Choice D. So the choice is getting simpler, essentially, this morning. And just to be clear, Choice A, the Adaptive Sex Offender Treatment Programme, John Williams, Sarah Futcher and Sarah Parker will be here in this room. And Choice B, an old friend of the university, Jonathan Beebe, will be presenting the PBS and the Good Lives model in the Lugano and Gala room. The good news is those rooms are adequate to deal with the numbers we've got today. If we could start promptly after your coffee break at 11 o'clock, please. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sarah Futcher. I'm a forensic nurse specialist. Originally, it was going to be myself and John Williams presenting this today. As most of you may know, the date changed and John has subsequently retired, and Dr. Lawrence Patterson is our new John. So that's why it's not John up here for those of you that knew John. Just make sure I can work through this. Okay, so thank you. I'm just going to start a little bit just to explain who we are. So both Lawrence and I work for the Forensic Community Learning Disabilities team. We're employed by Southern Health, and within the Learning Disabilities Service, we have 6 core areas that the Learning Disabilities Services work towards. The service, obviously, that is key for us is the forensic area of practice, but we also work within mental health, which includes dementia, challenging behaviour, epilepsy, complex health, and autism. The Forensic Learning Disabilities team supports our wider community LD teams. So in Basingstoke, it's based at Dame Mary Fagan House. There are teams in Southampton, out in Totton, the New Forest area, and across Hampshire. With the exception of where kind of Solent work within Portsmouth areas. And the idea is that we supplement that team when individuals come in with forensic needs, which are more complex, and we work jointly with them. We also receive a great deal of our referrals via the police and directly from probation services. That's mostly for patients that are being discharged from, released from prison, and are wishing to access kind of further treatment support. So in terms of what we actually work within, our predominant areas are sexually inappropriate behaviour, which is why we're going to talk to you about the Sex Offender Treatment Programme today, fire and arson, anger and violence, and undifferentiated needs, such as kind of theft and the areas that don't neatly fit into the other boxes. But for a lot of the guys, they may actually dip in and out of different areas, particularly things such as kind of anger and violence associated with sexually inappropriate behaviour, in which case we may use a kind of different approach with people. So for the purpose of today, we're going to be talking about the Adapted Sex Offender Treatment Programme. We'll tell you a little bit about our referral criteria, the assessment of the programme itself, and a little bit about the experience of the patients. We're running a group at the moment, and we did ask our current group for any feedback that they felt would be useful to tell you today. So some of that is actually from the current group that we're halfway through running. So what is treatment then? So when we're talking about treatment, obviously there's a whole host of various areas that need to be considered. In terms of sex offender treatment, you could be thinking about things such as the medication, either to treat the kind of comorbid issues, or maybe kind of benzodiazepines or something else that's kind of going on alongside it. And there's the use of things such as anti-libidinals, which is a little bit kind of controversial and isn't something that we actually advocate or use within our service. We focus predominantly on the talking therapy side, and the Adapted Sex Offender Treatment Programme is certainly a cognitive behaviour therapy type, which would fall within that factor. We think about treatment versus management, and a large part of what we do falls within, obviously, the management side. We do a lot of risk assessments, and we work alongside social services, police, probation and care agencies to make sure that they've got robust management plans in place. And we work with the patients as collaborative partners where possible for them to be very much included in that process. With regards to the management side as well, we work with a lot of people that aren't able to engage in CBT and certainly aren't necessarily able to engage in a talking therapy, in which case we would try and do whatever we could do in terms of supporting them to develop the skills to manage their own behaviour, but we may not be able to engage them in a treatment programme in its traditional sense. The purpose of doing the treatment programme is obviously around kind of reducing the risks. You can put management strategies in place, but that won't change the behaviour. And we really want to focus on teaching people skills to manage their own behaviours so that they can develop those skills in making new relationships, in meeting new people, and whatever it is that's kind of meaning that at the moment they're stuck in this kind of offending behaviour. And Lawrence will kind of come on to how we do that in a moment. So internal behaviour. So for the purpose of the adapted SOTP, it's currently designed for offenders with an IQ between 65 and 80. It's available within Hampshire. Our service run the programme. And we follow the guidance from the Sex Offender Treatment South East Collaborative Intellectual Disability Services, the SOTSEC ID, which Glenys Murphy, who was mentioned in the previous presentation, is actually the person that leads on a lot of that research and leads on that training. It's a collaborative group of professionals, and it's very much about the research and engagement of sex offenders with a learning disability in treatment. And programmes like this must only be undertaken by those who have been trained and have the appropriate skills to do so, and it really needs to be facilitated by either a trained, qualified CBT therapist or a clinical psychologist-led programme. In terms of who it's for, so it encompasses a wide range of behaviours for both contact offences, your physical contact offences, your download offences, and also non-contact offences such as exposure, etc. The prevalence rate is actually very difficult, as it was again touched on in the previous presentation. The rate of sexual offending for males with a learning disability isn't really fully known. A lot of the research into populations includes mental health, intellectual disabilities, learning difficulties and autism, and so therefore there aren't really any large-scale studies that will tell us what the prevalence is. What has been done does suggest that actually the prevalence rates are very similar to that of the general population. But at the moment, as I say, the complexities of a large-scale studies means that there just isn't data out there, really. So our team, we accept people with a learning disability, so the traditional classification of IQ below 70, associated deficits in functioning, with an onset for adulthood, with the added thing of requiring an adapted forensic service. The main problem we have is that the Adapted Sex Offender Treatment Programme is licensed really for people with an IQ up to 80. The criminal justice system, the National Probation Service programmes, don't work with people with an IQ below 80. So if we then only work with people with an IQ of 70 or below, you have this 10 gap. And it's a really big, difficult area for us that we have been talking to our commissioners about, and are trying to work alongside probation services to be as flexible as possible. And there have been discussions whereby we're trying to seek extra funding, etc., so that we can still work with this vulnerable group, because it really does make up a large area of referrals that we receive. And as it stands at the moment, National Probation Service just don't have the skills and training to work in that client group, and it really is a kind of worrying area. So in terms of the programme itself then, we do a lot of pre-assessments before we even get to the point of doing the programme with the person. This will give us a really good idea of where their knowledge gaps are, where their risks are, etc. So we always start with the formulation to try and pull together the contextual factors around how an offence has occurred, and really trying to understand what's happened for a person. And that helps us to work out whether anything else needs to be done before we can get onto this programme. You've got the issue of kind of coexisting difficulties. If somebody is having a lot of issues around anger, for example, it's very difficult to pull them into a group programme and work on their sex offending when actually they're not going to be able to work in that group setting. So you've got competing interests there around risk assessment, risk management, alongside what treatment comes first. And then an array of specific sex offending type assessments, the assessment of sexual knowledge, victim empathy scale, the SOSAS, the QAXO looks at their attitudes and tries to pull out common themes around offending. I think the most useful one for us is the Sex Offender Treatment Intervention Progress Scale. That's a kind of informal discussionary tool where we collect a lot of data about their thoughts, their feelings, their fantasies, etc. And it helps to foster that open relationship, which is really important. And obviously an assessment of their skills needed to be able to engage in CBT. The structure of the programme, it runs for about 52 weeks, so about a year, which is a long time for people. It's 2 hours a week at the moment. We do one-to-one work for pre, mid and post-assessments. We also do one-to-one work to develop a relapse prevention plan, which is obviously really important for driving that forward into the future. We're very heavily involved with input at MAPA meetings, other management forums or CPA, and the difficult one is that individuals are usually court mandated or on some sort of licence to attend. That creates all sorts of issues in terms of the second one here around motivation. So people that are actually coerced into undertaking these programmes, evidence suggests that they don't get the best treatment outcomes. So we focus heavily on the motivation at the beginning, and one of the ways that we do that is using good lives goals. We know that offences usually occur because people are trying to seek out something that is something that is completely natural, perhaps a relationship, and usually often for the guys that we work with, they don't have the social skills, they don't have the relationship skills. There's something missing in that translation of skills in order to seek that out. And so we look at what we call primary goods, which is a big ethos around the goal setting, and we look at things such as relationships, activities, being good at things, etc. And we work with individuals to identify what they want out of life. And what we find is that usually then aligns in with the treatment. And when people are motivated and they have a reason for doing something that's not the judges said you have to, they're more likely to want to engage with us. And so they're more likely to get better outcomes at the output of it. We do a big thing on basic group rules. So everybody there contributes to what those rules should be. And we have a very difficult thing in that around social setting. So one of the big things that people say that they like about the group is that people are often very socially isolated, and the group allows the guys in it to have an output once a week that they are actually coming to. The difficulty for that is that we really don't want the guys meeting outside the group. One, because those that are on licence often aren't allowed to, and they'll end up breaching their conditions. And two, when you've got guys that are already at risk of offending, at risk of kind of being conditioned by other people, they're a very vulnerable group of individuals. And so we have to be very mindful about how we can work those relationships if, say, they go off and get the train together and things like that. But the group then moves on, so that's the setting stages. We move on, we do sex education, relationship and social skills. So we try to skill people up in those areas where the deficits might be, and we do a lot of work on how they can get relationships. We work on general behaviours, and we introduce people generally to the concept of thoughts, feelings, actions or behaviours. I think at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague.
So I get the opportunity to talk to you all about a psychological model which is very much central to the Sex Offender Treatment Programme. It's been adapted by the SOTSEC Collaborative. Looking at the manual before I came for the SOTSEC programme, before I came today, they do quote some unpublished data where out of a sample around 400 people with a learning disability, this is adults, known to a local authority department, around 41% had been known to display sort of challenging behaviours of a sexual type at some point and recorded as such. And of that number, around 17% had some contact with the police. And again, of that number, only 4% had received any form of a conviction. So when you consider that this programme predominantly provides for people who have been to court and may have been to prison and have received some form of conviction, we are probably only reaching a reasonably small number of people. So I suppose listening to this talk, you might want to consider this established programme. It is running nationally. It is, overseen by the Tizard Centre and Liz Murphy's team. But there is work to be done with those people out there with a learning disability who display challenging behaviours of a sexual nature, who have difficulties related to their behaviours, but may not actually ever receive a conviction and may have very limited and unproductive contacts with the police. So do think if you can consider ways to apply this to your own practice. I know we've talked already about how the programme needs to be run and overseen by qualified CPT and clinical psychology staff. That doesn't mean that you can't take some of the principles away and actually make good use of them in your own services. So this model, David Finkelhor's 1984 model of offending, is also known as the preconditions model for offending. And it covers these four key areas around fantasies, which largely links to motivation. And with David Finkelhor, he was particularly considering with child sex abusers. He was particularly considering what might motivate a perpetrator to sexually abuse a child. And with this adapted model, we consider the kind of thought processes and other aspects that might lead to motivation for an offender. And the second stage of this model is around distorted thinking, cognitive distortion. And this, for David Finkelhor's model, is about overcoming internal inhibition against abuse. Because everybody has an inbuilt, obviously, sense of conscience, and people with a learning disability do equally. And this sense of distorted thinking overriding this internal kind of inhibitory mechanism. The third stage is around planning, and this can obviously include more slow acting or grooming kind of conditioning. And this is about the perpetrator overcoming external inhibitions to abuse. So there are quite a lot of environmental factors which would actually limit somebody's likelihood of committing such an offence. And the fourth of these preconditions is around actually committing the offence. And for David Finkelhor, this was around overcoming the child's or others' resistance. So clearly with our programme, we're not just working with people that have offended against children, we're working with people with a variety of sexual offending type presentations. And we've adapted the model to make it, I suppose, more simplistic and more readily acceptable and understandable to our client group with learning disabilities. And we present this model with a slope, a slippery slope. The idea being that you begin early phase, fantasising, and if you begin distorted thinking and perhaps you continue in those patterns, there's a stronger likelihood that you'd perhaps undertake some form of planning. Perhaps not that consciously aware that you're doing that, and we'll consider that in a moment. And the further you go down this process cognitively, the more likely you are to commit the offence. And we make sure that we consider with the guys in the group each of these stages in a lot of depth, thinking about their own presenting offence issues. And we start with less sexualised examples. So it might start with minor rule infringements or taking a chocolate bar from a shop, things that people may have been exposed to in the past. We certainly give enough time to considering the consequences. It is a simplistic model. I think it needs to be reasonably simple. It is an older model, and there are obviously adaptations to this out there. It's something that the service in Southampton has stuck with for the last 10 years and has produced good results. So that's why we're still presenting it today. So considering each of these stages on this slope in a bit more depth, there is evidence that people don't offend unless they've had some thoughts about it before. And there is an idea that we try to help the guys in the group to understand that fantasising and paying attention to particular stimuli, whether it's television or pornographic materials on the internet, can alter the way the brain processes information. And this leads to a development of motivation to commit or to act in a particular way. One of the guys described this as preferences. And this guy's attended the group before, and he's clearly learned, coming back, he's learned quite a lot about this early stage of a slippery slope process. And it is around that kind of preferential attentional bias. Finkelhor argues that the following three conditions underlie motivation to offend. Emotional congruence, in which the sexual contact with the victim satisfies a profound emotional need. So we're dealing with guys that haven't necessarily developed ways to meet their emotional needs, or necessarily even recognise their emotional needs. And the second condition, underlying motivation, is around sexual arousal. And certainly for the collaborative work, there's consideration that masturbation plays quite a role in fantasising, and actually something about reaching orgasm when exposed to and particularly associated with illegal type fantasies does help develop motivation to offend. So we have to pay quite close attention to those kind of aspects for our guys attending the group. And then there's a sense around the third condition for Finkelhor, that blockage when alternative sources of sexual gratification are either not available or are less satisfactory for the individual. So we're looking at guys often with limited social networks, limited opportunities to form more adaptive relationships, and perhaps they've not got the language skills, or perhaps they're suffering with autism that means that they struggle to understand how to form a relationship in a more appropriate manner. And this stage of the programme, we're exploring knowledge related to laws, related to sexual behaviours, because not all fantasies are wrong. Clearly, there's a lot you could fantasise about that's perfectly adaptive. Some of our guys in the group at the moment fantasise about, say, owning their own garage, or being the Prime Minister is one of the fantasies for one of the guys in the group. So we'd start with the less sensitised type fantasies. And not all sexual fantasies are wrong. So this is where it's important for the guys to be understanding that the law means that at 16 and under, it's against the law to initiate a sexual act. But there are quite a few things they would consider and feel motivated to do that are within the law. So we're helping them try to differentiate where that line is. So that even when they're at this early stage of fantasy, they've got an awareness if what they're fantasising about actually would break the law. So considering this second step to the slippery slope model in a bit more depth, cognitive distortions is a reasonably difficult phrase for people with a learning disability to understand. So you might be thinking of this wonky thoughts, lies, excuses. Ultimately, it's about minimisation of likely harm or impact to a victim. So those are the sorts of things that we need to be considering, and how people's thought processes take them to this kind of an end. Arguably, most people have some inhibitions against the sexual abuse of others, including children, and this inhibition is not a source of motivation, it merely releases motivation. And no one is a criminal all of the time. So clearly, this programme, it's important to explore what makes a difference at particular times, in particular scenarios for our individual attendees. And you have to persuade yourself or convince yourself that doing a crime, committing a crime, a sexual act against another is acceptable. And this can be socialised within peer groups. Certainly one of the guys attending at the moment talks about spending time in the pub in a local area where he would observe with his friends, ladies walking by, and they'd rate the sexiness of the ladies. And this is an area where he knows the cameras and he knows the layout of the area, he knows the blind spots, and has committed, at least we know, one sexual offence in this area, but possibly others. And that's something that's been socialised for this man. This man we think probably has autism and struggles to form appropriate relationships. And this is a socialised sense we're working with, where he's conditioned to believe that this is an acceptable way to judge others and then act towards them. There's a bit of a thought bubble thing with some wonky thoughts. These are the kind of examples of what people genuinely think in relation to committing an act or sexual offending against others. I won't get caught. I mean, our gentleman who considered where the layout of the cameras are has spoken about the sense that he thought he wouldn't get caught on multiple occasions. I'm not sure that's everything that was distorted about his thinking, but it was part of it. They'll really like it. I'm teaching them about sex. That's one that Finkelhor refers to with child sex abusers, this idea that you're doing something to educate the other. For people with a learning disability, it can be very difficult to understand social cues, consent and capacity. They're smiling, so they must want to. That sense of perhaps the victim at some stage may smile. There may be things that mislead the person. They may make judgments, and their thinking may be further distorted by their misunderstanding of the social cues from the victim. The third step that we consider with this model is around planning. And as I said earlier, this is about overcoming the external barriers and getting closer to the victim. And this can literally mean getting closer to the victim in terms of distance. We've certainly got people who would opportunistically get closer, and emotionally, so building trust with others. And this could lead to increased opportunities to commit such an offence. And this can take a long period of time, or it can be something that occurs very quickly in a brief space of time. So for the guys on the group, it's about really trying to elicit from them things they may not have considered before around the planning that may have gone on, and making choices is a particular aspect within this, because these will often be posed as seemingly irrelevant decisions, not unrelated decisions to sex offending. For example, one of the guys we have committed his index offence at the end of a series of offences due to deciding to get very, very drunk at a party where there were actually 3 of his potential victims present. That's a seemingly irrelevant decision as he presented it. He decided to drink heavily, and others peer pressured him to drink heavily, and it absolutely reduced those external barriers for him, as well as the motivation and the internal barriers for him. I mean, grooming, this is something that is a particular type of planning and takes place over a longer period, and can often involve repeated small actions that make external inhibitors less likely. And actually, it can be about grooming other people, not just the victim, family members or staff members, and the perpetrator acting in a way that may condition people to relax supervision or boundaries towards them. And sometimes this can seem very subtle when it's happening. So we have to pay enough attention to this in the treatment programme. The fourth step is obviously around the offence itself. Overcoming resistance. There may not always be direct resistance at the time of the offence, particularly if grooming has been part of the process, or there may well be a lack of awareness for victims, which may mean that they don't resist at the time. And certainly within learning disability care settings, there may be a lack of awareness of their victim. And within the peer group, we reflect together about their actions, and this is an absolutely crucial phase to the treatment programme. It's something that the guys attending do find difficult to do, and is treated very sensitively and given enough time. We then consider the consequences together, and often there's learning for people in the group from others around the experiences of going to court, perhaps the experiences of going into prison. So it's about opening the group members' eyes a little bit to the kind of the consequences that can occur to them. And that can be particularly important, I suppose, when we're thinking about rule infringements like a breach of a SOPO, restrictions that have been broken, so somebody's gone into custody or been recalled due to a breach of restriction. And they might struggle to understand then how they've broken the law, what the actual offence has been committed, who the victim is. So we try to make sense of that for people by applying this slippery slope model in all ways, including those breaches of order, not just the direct offending. So thinking about individual specific offences, as I've said, we spend a lot of time working through this with each of the guys in the group, working through the Finkelhor model. It can be difficult for clients to recall offence details. Some offences may have taken place years before. So there's a sense of recall and difficulties around that. There may also be a sense that people don't want to admit to what's happened, and this clearly can be linked to guilt or shame for the individual, and that can be helpful actually within the group process to uncover and just consider together as an emotional state. And guilt and shame related to past behaviours, being in a group can shift people on from a position of denial, and we've certainly seen that several times in the group programme. However, if a person's unable to move on in this way using the group, we would tend to deviate them from the group and offer individual sex offender treatment work as indicated instead. An unwillingness to reflect, that may occur for some of the guys, some of the offenders attending. And overcoming these challenges, as a psychologist, I feel it can involve the use of clinical formulation and a chronology to anchor the attendees' recall in events from around the same time, look at the social patterns they were engaged with, the disappointments they'd experienced, the relationships that may have ended, closely, proximally to the time of the offending. It's very useful to have police records, to be able to look at the witness statements and reports to counter denial as it arises. And it is extremely important, because it's a long programme, it's over a year, to revisit motivation to change with the clients in the group and inviting encouragement from peers in the group. So if one person is finding it difficult to consider the benefit of their relapse prevention planning work, and all of this process through the slippery slope model takes us to this relapse prevention planning work, it's really useful actually to have people that have perhaps done the programme all or some of it before, and perhaps have gone into prison and experienced the negative social consequences aligned with that, to revisit that motivation as a group. This is one of the ways that we would lay out an account of an offence. It's something called a storyboard. So in the centre you have your narrative account of what happened, and very closely aligned with that, we're looking at these distorted type thoughts, trying to pull them out as they arise and represent them. Feelings and emotions that the person may have experienced, and very often there will be some heightened experience of anger or anxiety associated with perhaps the planning phases and then perhaps the initiation phases as well. Physical feelings, it's very important to try and think the guys about how much they can recognise internally within themselves about their arousal state changing, what they need to pay attention to within their relapse prevention thought processes. And that little television, it's meant to be a television screen in the bottom right, is around this playing visualisation of imagery around fantasy, and the idea that that potentially will motivate somebody to act and perhaps to come back and do this again, perhaps to seek the same kind of reinforcing stimulus more than once. Following on from the four-stage model based around Finkelhor's theory, we spend a good chunk of time on the programme considering victim empathy. And a really important part of this is around emotional recognition. There is evidence to suggest that internal changes in empathy is a longer-acting deterrent against reoffending than purely individual threats of negative consequences. And we think together about the effects long-term and short-term of the actions that have been taken by the men in the group. The effects on themselves, the effects on others, not just the victim, but expanding that out to other people in the network around them. We would probably start this kind of work asking them to think about times when they have been a victim, to try and get themselves into that perspective. And we've usually used non-sexualised examples. There may be sexualised examples that are appropriate. You have to be very sensitive to the nature of the abuse that's being suffered by the men in the group. For example, theft or assault, victims of violent assaults. Often our guys have been victims of thefts and assaults, so we're able to help them reflect on being a victim in that way. Part of the process is also to ask them to write letters to their victims. And these letters, they're not sent. However, the guys will often need a lot of support to do this, to be able to write something that they feel they truly understand and believe in, if considered in enough depth. And then ask them to write a letter in response from their victim's point of view. And this may include longer-term effects for the victim. Finally, within the sex offender treatment programme, we do some individualised work around relapse prevention planning. A personalised plan to help prevent relapse, and very closely using the four-stage model we've just considered in relation to specific sexual offending for the individual. And deliberately uses safe alternatives to fantasies. So we specify, this is not safe, this is safe. And obviously it's not an exhaustive list around what's a safe fantasy. Distorted thinking would specify the opposite to some of the distorted thinking that we've been able to elicit from the gentlemen in the group. And the same for planning. So instead of planning in a way that may lead the person to commit an offence, we very deliberately focus on planning in a manner that will lead them away from being likely to committing an offence. With a real emphasis on coping skills and alternative behaviours to offending. And for me, positive behavioural support needs to form a strong part of this. Thinking about what people can already do, where they can develop their abilities, with just a little bit of support perhaps from people around them. Certainly there's people in the group who receive social care packages of support. Equally, there are people that don't. So we have to be quite mindful. This is why it's on an individual basis around what's around people, what resources they have. This slide just shows you the repeat of the previous assessment measures that Sarah already outlined. And these are repeated to establish areas of change for individuals and fixed aspects that may not have been amenable to change during the programme. And this helps to develop the risk profile for the individual. So it is a long programme, and by the end of it, what we aim to achieve is a very in-depth understanding of somebody's ability to affect internal change, their likelihood to seek to overcome external inhibitions and environmental factors. So it will give us, about each of these specific men attending, a great deal of information to plan to keep them and others around them safe. However, it is only a very small proportion of people with a learned disability that may act in a sexualised offending kind of way that will access this kind of group. Interestingly, the manual also told me earlier that around 40% of people nationally attending these programmes have not had a conviction. So I'm wondering whether our programme, we largely have been looking at people with a conviction, but nationally around the country, there are almost half of people attending who have not had a conviction. So there's some flexibility around that. Naturally, there's challenges in delivering this sort of a programme. It has been running for 10 years in Southampton. John Williams has been, the lifeblood of the process. He's in Sri Lanka today, so he's unable to talk to you all, and you've got me instead. Some of the challenges to delivering the programme are around the sense of IQ and this borderline status that people experience. It can often mean that people aren't entitled to learning disability follow-up support at the end of the programme, and perhaps they've reached the end of their licence, and perhaps there isn't a great deal that probation are going to do either. Some of the other challenges, maybe as Sarah outlined before, around mandated attendance and a motivation to engage. Personally, I think that can be overcome with people. Perhaps I'm more optimistic, but I think the nature of the group means that the gentlemen together reflect and come to a point of wanting to change something productively. All it takes, really, I've seen, is one person to have a very positive experience, which is the complete opposite away from the likelihood they might offend, and the other men seem to be interested in trying to mimic and learn and gain something like that person's got. Denial, minimisation. Because we have multiple facilitators in the group, at least 3 per group of up to 6 men, it does mean that denial and minimisation can be subtly noted down and revisited at an appropriate point in the sessions. You don't necessarily have to tackle that directly head on as it arises. And this can be tackled with individual one-to-one work as well. In terms of attendance, we will liaise closely with probation officers, inform every time somebody attends. If somebody's failing to attend, they may be in breach of licence conditions. That could have strong consequences for them. However, if attendance is just not improving over time, it will impact the group, so people may be removed from the programme. And that will be discussed very openly, very clearly with all the men attending. In terms of the therapeutic climate, there may be elements to personalities that the group members have that don't gel well together, so that takes careful, sensitive management of those kind of dynamics. There may be issues around the offences. For example, if a child offender is discussing their offence and somebody else in the group has been a victim of child sexual abuse. So there is a need to be very sensitive to what's being presented, what's likely to come up in those groups. There is also a sense that there isn't a lot of resource for this kind of programme. Financially, it's reasonably expensive. There's not enough resource locally to do this more than 1 group a year. So for 6 men attending for a year, it's a reasonably low, slow turnaround. wherever there are some good results. This is almost our final slide, and it's the one that Sarah referred to earlier about some of the perspectives of the gentlemen within the group. I'll let you read it if you like. Some of the best things are the social aspects of the group, the nature of being able to share together, reflect together. However, as Sarah outlined, we need to be very aware if members of the group are meeting outside of sessions, especially if they're restricted from liaising and socialising with other sexual offenders or offenders. And it's notable that the things that the guys consistently report as being the most difficult are disclosure of their offences and having to revisit those times, perhaps if they've wanted to feel they can forget it and move on, and perhaps others around them have led them to believe that that's something they can do, put that away and move on. That's one of the more difficult things for people to approach. There is data out there on recidivism rates. I'm sorry I haven't got to quote you today. I was reading some of the stuff that Glynis Murphy's put up on the Tizard website, so please feel free to have a look on there on the SOTSEC ID website. There is detail on the prevalence rates for people. I think early in the programme, when it was first being delivered, there was reductions of around 10% for people attending this programme as opposed to people not attending this programme. However, since then, there is much more, efficacy kind of data that's been published. I'm sorry, I don't have any direct data from our programme to present to you today, but please do have a look on the website. There's a very useful PowerPoint on there that will help you. That's just who we are, where we work, how to contact us if you'd like to, and that's it. So thank you very much. Yes, as a clinical psychologist, I have to receive clinical supervision very frequently. So currently my clinical supervision is coming from another consultant clinical psychologist who's worked in forensic services for quite a long time. So yes, I do. And actually I act as Sarah's clinical supervisor currently in terms of reflecting on. I'm wondering if your questions about the nature of what it's like to have to listen to this kind of traumatic recounting of experience and perhaps the vicarious trauma that can come with that. And certainly, yes, provisions, they are essential around supervision.
I think, I think for anybody who has to hear such intimate and horrendous details, on a regular basis, it does affect people. And that obviously you have to have a place to offload those concerns. So I'm just wondering, those who facilitate these groups, are they adequately supported? Because if you are not supported, all the members who facilitate that group, then you can't support those that need to be supported effectively.
I fully agree with you. I know locally we are making sure that the supervision provided to facilitators within the group. I'm absolutely certain that will be part of the process for SOTSEC Collaborative nationally. And it is an essential aspect to listening to that kind of abuse, not just because it can be difficult to hear and leave an effect, but you could become desensitised to the nature of what you're hearing as well, I think, and perhaps sometimes forget that what you're hearing is actually very shocking. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I have got a colleague. The next group is here.
We are around anyway, so if people want to ask us anything, you can find us in the lunch break, that's fine.
Sorry.
I need to get to the other workshop.
Thank you. You got to go and